Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Girl Talk with Issy. So, for today's conversation, it is all about feminism as the way to social change. So, our guest speaker is going to be Nifemi, who is just doing some amazing things, and she studied gender studies and she's very active in helping gender organizations. So, if you just give me a few seconds, I'll invite her in for the conversation. Nice to see some people tuning in. Hello. Hi. Hello, hi, nice to see you. Nice to see you. So I will start the conversation as soon as Nifemi joins us. Thank you for joining us. Feminism as the way to social change. Okay. Pin comments. Hello. Hi.
Hi, how are
Nice
you?
to see you. I'm fine. Nice to see you.
Same
Wow.
here. I'm so excited.
Yes. Awesome. I'm excited also. Like I've been following you and I think you're doing amazing work. I think I saw like a picture of you at the UN. I'm just like, this girl is doing something. So I'm just
Thank
excited to have this
you.
conversation with you. Yes. So thank you
Thank you so
people for
much.
in, and I want us to just like get right in the conversation, and people who come in later can always watch the full IGTV video. So I just want to welcome our guest speaker, Nifemi. Welcome.
Thank you. So
Nice to
I'm
have
not
you
as
here.
I'm not as sociable as the way I am on Instagram, and so I'm like,
No. It's okay. This is a conversation. So,
but I'm
like, yes,
excited. I'm really excited.
yes, I'm so excited. And so, for today's session of Girl Talk with EC, we are talking about feminism as the way to social change. So, to just start off the conversation, I want you to help us define feminism. What would you say feminism is about?
So before I define feminism, one of the ways I
Yes.
have been taught from a feminist perspective is to always recognize my positionality. And so before I start, I would like to say that from the Yoruba tribe and I'm
Yes.
Nigerian, I'm
Mm-hmm.
educated, and I'm from a middle class family. Because when I recognize my positionality, it's it's what do you call it? It gives you a perspective of my standpoint and where I'm coming from and how some of my biases can affect the way I speak about a particular issue. And so, why defining feminism? One of the what do you call it? Feminist African feminist scholars that have um okay, I think oh, I thought I was frozen. So I one of the feminist
No.
scholars that I really like is Amma Ata Adel, and she defines feminism as an ideology, and what do you call it? Feminism is an ideology that is towards the empowerment of women, and what do you call it? Also towards the development of women. And this is something that this is an ideology that I really love because it centers women so it centers women, and it means that anybody can be a feminist as long as you are in help women towards achieving their what do you call it their overall goals, achieving development, those kind of things like
Mm-hmm.
that. And so feminism is just about it's a social movement. It's a framework that's towards advocating for the rights of women and their equal participation in life, in social development, in economics, in politics, so many things. And so I think for me, while I have looked at all the definitions of feminism, one thing that has stood out to me is that anybody can be a feminist, but you have to
Yeah.
work towards centering the problems of women. And so that's what makes feminism distinct. So yes,
Thank you so much for that. Like you said so many important things. Even the way you started before you gave the definition, I like the fact that you said that you have to define yourself as a Nigerian woman and as a middle class woman because that affects the way you define feminism, which is something
yes,
that I usually don't think about. But our different backgrounds, the way somebody grows up in defines actually how they view feminism. So thank you for
yes,
pointing that out. And also just the
yes,
fact that you said that anybody can be a feminist as long as you are advocating for certain causes that pertain to gender rights. You know, if you're advocating for that when it comes to social, political, economic, you can be called a feminist. It's not just something that
yes,
only women attach themselves, only women who study gender rights attach themselves. So thank you for that wonderful
yes.
definition. So we are
Thank
talking
you.
about feminism in the African continent. So I want us to just talk about how do you think gender issues affect African nations as a whole?
One of the things one of the ways I would like to start is by saying that gender issues begin from the family. And
Mm,
so while growing up, you see that girls have already been conditioned to put themselves first. And so, for example, I always have conversations with my friends and even a lot of people, and they say, "Oh, I have to cook Indomie for my brother." And so that is when you begin to recognize that girls, particularly, are made to do the house chores. They've been conditioned to think like that. Girls have been conditioned that, oh, even when she marries, what do you call it? She's the one that bears the burden of taking care of her parents when they are old, even though she has other siblings. And so that's why I talk about positionality. And so when you see a girl child that is also the firstborn, then that
mm,
talks about the so many layers of burden that is placed on those positions and the responsibility of the family on her. And so, besides even the family, the what do you call it, the family chairs and her condition in the family, you should even think about education. And so, even in the classroom, so when we talk
mm.
about education, because I'm also a Black feminist, and I always like to say that some of the ways I talk about positionality, I have been taught by many Black feminist scholars, and they've
Wow.
influenced the way I think about things. And so, for example, here we talk about girls being shortchanged in the classroom. For example, you see that while boys are very competent with maths, girls are more into English, or not just English, literary works. And so when you bring that into our educational system, you see now that who takes home economics in school? It's the
Mm-hmm.
girls.
Yeah.
Who look at the percentage of people that do further maths in school? It's the boys. And so this is where all of these things start from. And so you just see, even when, what are the materials that are being used in the classroom to teach us? And so, for example, if you're coming from a Black feminist perspective, you see that, what do you call it, while students are being taught in the class, girls don't see themselves in the textbook. And so when
Wow.
you're talking about the African continent in itself, you see that in our classrooms, some of the things that we read, it continues to perpetuate that stereotype that women should what do you call it? They should take up silence. Women should
Yeah.
relegate themselves to the private the private sphere. And so these are just some of the ways that, what do you call it, gender issues affect the African nation. And so even when we are talking about sustainable development, I always say that education is not enough. When I say education, access to education is not enough for development. And so when you
Mm.
look at countries like, I think, Sierra Leone and I think Tanzania, I'm not really sure, but there are two African countries particularly that girls have access to education. However, girls are forcefully subjected to virginity tests in school.
Wow.
And so when you go to school and they subject you to this kind of to this kind of policy, for example, it disrupts your educational system. And so what one of the reasons why they do this is to hinder pregnant girls or adolescent mothers, to
Mm.
uproot them from the educational system. And so you see these shame-based cultures. And so when I'm talking about gender and how gender issues and how it affects the African continent, it means that we need to start rethinking the ways that we've just been thinking about stereotypes or breaking down some of these issues. And so I just gave you some perspective on education, on even from the home and
Yeah.
some other things. So
Thank
yes.
you. Thank you. That was a really wonderful. Thank you for the people who have just joined in. So I asked her, how do gender issues affect African countries? And your response was really enlightening, because you started with the fact that it starts from the home, it starts from the family, the way daughters are being raised, and the fact that they all already assume that it's their responsibility to take care of their siblings if you're a girl child. And also when it comes to education levels, how we particularly assume that certain girls have to take certain courses, or we'll just assume, like, even though I love English, it's particularly, stereotypical that the girls are putting arts and home economics. So we can see all these aspects of gender issues coming from the home and the educational aspects also. So thank you so
Yes.
much for providing that response. And now I want to talk about, like, what are the solutions? Because I don't only want to talk about challenges. We need to know, how can we really work to rectify the issues, how gender issues starts, like how can feminism be used to solve those issues?
So, like I keep saying, I was brought up, not brought up, but like most of the people that have influenced my ideologies are Black feminists. And so,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things I always like to say is that even for when starting from the home again, it's not enough to just say that we need to tell girls to do this, but rather, how are the parents in the family, how are they raising their children? And just like
Yeah.
Chimamanda has said,
Mm-hmm.
you need to raise your boys, or of course, like other children, in a feminist way. And so these are one of the ways, or one of the ways we can tackle this issue. At the same time, I think that I always say it that colonialism has affected gender or gender perspective, particularly in the African continent. And so even when you look at church, for example, I really like one of the I really believe in allyship, and I think that the church has constituted a lot of problems. Not just the church, religion rather has constituted a lot of problems when it comes to gender issues. And so, for example, on Sundays, when it's time for counseling, who are those that go for counseling? Most of the time, they are usually women. And what are the advice that are given to these women? Oh, if you are in a if you're in an abusive relationship, pray to God, tell God to change the man, tell God to change your
Yeah.
husband, until one day you realize that she's passed away from that violence. And so it means that we need to start working with not just community leaders, we need to work with religious leaders on how they
Yes.
can, what do you call it, we can start
Mm-hmm.
thinking from a feminist perspective. I really like education because I always talk about development. Anything that does not talk about center development within women issues, for me, I don't understand the relevance
Yeah.
of that. And so I always talk about education in the sense that, what do you call it, girls should be given equal opportunities in the
Yeah.
classroom. And so, like I said before, access to education is not enough. How are you how is the teacher, for example, how are they
Yeah.
making sure that the how are we writing our own stories, for example? And so in the classroom, books like Chimamanda's works or books that have been written by women should also be on the shelf or in the library, or recommended materials. And so these are some of the ways of how do you reclaim your narrative, because I
Yeah.
think that one of the ways that Africa can develop is by we reclaiming our narratives, recentering our own materials. And so when you
Yeah.
even look at African feminism as a whole, you see that, what do you call it, books that have been written by African women scholars, they're not, you don't even know about them. And so that's one of the reasons why I started African feminism, because you see that people don't know Wangari Maathai. And I said, wow, you don't know Lema Gowri. Okay. And so we need to start teaching ourselves, what do you call it, about ourselves. So that's
Yes. We need to
that
start
kind of
telling
thing.
our stories. Yeah.
Yes. And so,
Yeah.
because
Honestly.
Yes. And so when
Yeah.
you think about I also wanted to say that when you think about feminism comes from a Western standpoint. And so that was why I talked about my positionality at the beginning, that feminism, what do you call it, did at the beginning, or the history of feminism did not center Black women's problems, or women, or rather women of African descent. It did not center their problems. And so this is why you have so many ideologies like womanism,
Yeah.
Stiwanism, Black feminist thoughts, African feminism, so that it can cater for the distinct problems that women in different contexts face.
Yeah.
And so I feel like I'm diverting right now, but
No,
yes, I
everything
think I'm
you are
just
saying is important, yes.
yes.
Because, okay, so the question was around how can feminism really help to solve gender issues? And once again, you brought it back to the home, that it starts with also the way parents raise their children, and they should also raise the young boys to be more understanding of certain issues. And also when it comes to education, the way teachers function matters. And the point that you even made about Africans telling their own stories and narrative is so crucial. And this is something that I keep saying. Like, our narratives are being told about from other people's perspective. So when I was in the States, this is even a
Yes.
different conversation. You'd understand that people's narrative of the African continent is always that of poverty and things like that. So we do need to tell our stories.
Yes.
And especially what you said
Yes.
about hearing more stories about African women scholars is so huge, because even though I love studying gender studies as a minor, what I noticed was that I didn't really get that focus on the African continent. But
Um
usually when it comes to American scholars, things like that, and their movements, the American women's movement in feminism. So the fact that we need to actually be reading more about African women scholars and their movements is so crucial. Which is why later we are going to talk about the courses that we teach, which is like very important, and how we need to actually imbibe that in the educational system, not just at university level when you now feel like you're passionate, you want to study this, but people should be studying it maybe from primary school to secondary school. So thank you again for that. That was wonderful. And
thank
I also
you.
want to address, like, how can each and every person imbibe principles of feminism? Because sometimes when you say the word feminism, it sounds like this big controversial word. So let's just break it down. How can people imbibe these little principles of it? Women and men.
Um I lost you at some point. I think my Wi-Fi was unstable. So could you
Oh,
repeat the
okay.
question?
Oh, yes. I said that how can everybody have these principles of feminism in them in society? How can we each utilize it?
Okay. Like
Yeah.
one of the things, like I keep saying again, Black feminism.
Yeah.
But one of the things
Yeah.
I have been taught to think of to imbibe a feminist perspective
Yeah.
is that always recognize your positionality. Recognizing your
Mm-hmm.
positionality is very important. And so, for example,
Mm-hmm.
if we were to speak about education in Nigeria, or even period poverty in Nigeria, or access to so many things, I'll be speaking about it from the fact that I am from a middle class family. I am from a
Mm-hmm.
family that values education, in the sense that my parents are educators. And so there's a lens to which I'm going to see something. And so this is why you
Yeah.
always talk about the standpoint of a king and the standpoint of the king's people. And so this is one of the things, that recognizing positionality is very important, so that you don't perpetuate the same harmful practices that you are trying to curb. And so another ways that I always talk about, what do you call it, imbibing a feminist attitude, is that language is very important. And so I
Yes.
am I'm really someone that talks about reclaiming our language. And so, for example, if you see with Africana feminism, you will see that I use K rather than C to spell my African. Because when you look at the African tradition, or not just the African tradition, the African context, you would see that K, you even if you look at the language, Africans, particularly in South Africa, or you're looking at Africa, K in I think Malawi and Kenya, you will see that K has been the letter that has been used in many of our African cultures rather than C. And so these are just like one of the ways of reclaiming our narratives through language, and not just language, but like when we as a person, for example, you hear people call women puta, and I'm like, or ashawo, all of those things like that. It's like, how do you, what do you call it? How do you move away from those kind of everyday words that
Derogatory
you've
word.
imbibed to think that, oh, it's just a normal thing, or that's what they say? Do you understand those kind of things like that? So
Mm-hmm.
language has always been a way of perpetuating injustice, particularly on women's bodies. And so these are one of the ways that I always say that. Or for example, when victims of sexual assault say, what do you call it? I have been
Mm-hmm.
violated, and it's what did you wear?
Yeah.
Did you smile? All of this is language. This is the way you're constructing language, and I think that it's very important. And for me, these are just like foundations that we can begin to um adopt a feminist perspective, like all of these things, even on social media, like all of these things like that.
Exactly.
And for me, like I said again, I've been through a black feminist perspective, me thinking about moving away from the binary. I know that's still complicated within the African context, and so like he and she, those kind of things. And I don't know, when you see now, people have been talking about not using queens, not like queens rather, but like saying that, oh, black women are strong, they're queens. People have been saying that
Yes.
you are perpetuating that same stereotype that, it's like black women take up that burden of motherhood. And when I say motherhood in the sense that she carries the whole burden
On her
of
shoulders.
the
Yeah.
family, of her children, of her husband, of the society, of the community, but no one carries her own burden. No, she does not have, there's no room for her to share her burden with someone. And so these are some of the ways. And I also like the idea of sisterhood, because I can see my
Yes.
best friend giving me a thumbs up. But
Yes.
like sisterhood is very important. And so for me, it's like not thinking of women as your competitors, but rather as it's your success is my success, and my success is your success. And so I really like Ubuntu pedagogy, that I am me because of who you have made me become, and that kind of thing. It's a chain. And so
Wow.
like those kind of things like that. So
That was wonderful. Thank you. All of your points, wonderful. So you said that, just to summarize, you said that in order to really imbibe the principles of feminism, we need to think about positioning, our own position in
yeah,
society. Oh, I just see a
positionality.
comment.
Yes.
Yes, we have to think about our positionality. We have to think about the language we use, which is very important. Because I even know in the past days, even the way people talk about rape culture, some people use it as a joke. They use the word rape as a joke. So people have to really think about language, and especially the way they refer to women with derogatory terms. That really needs to really, people really need to put that in perspective. And also what you just said about overall sisterhood and just being there for other women and supporting other women and not seeing other women as competitors, but knowing that we can all really
Yeah.
strive together and work together to achieve our goals. It's so important because no one person can just create change on their own. It's really by coming together that we can really be able to produce change in society. So thank you so much for that. That
Yes.
was just wonderful.
Thank you.
And now, what was the big crux of this stuff? Like, feminism is still like a big controversial word. Even though these days some people are beginning to embrace it, I still feel like there are so many misconceptions around it. And to be honest, calling yourself a feminist is not easy because there are so many labels. Believe me, there are so many labels. You can't even tell me something that somebody has not already called me or asked me before because I've said I'm a feminist. There are so many labels that people give you once you call yourself a feminist. So, what are some of the misconceptions around feminist, that term?
I always say that most of the time, the people that talk about negative things of feminism is that they don't even understand what it means. And so, even you
That is
see
it.
that, not just even, you see that even women themselves say, oh, I'm a feminist, but then, what do you call it? Oh, right. rather not, oh, I'm a feminist. They talk about the ills of feminism rather. And so I
Yes.
always say that you need to understand the concept of feminism, and that
Yeah.
it has always been Western, and that you need to understand context again, that I am in the African context. How does my positionality affect issues? For example, issues about the body, the way we have conversations about it is different, because in the African context, it's different. And so when you're looking at all the protests or the social movements that have taken place in, for example, with the Green Belt movement in Kenya by Wangari Maathai, or even in Liberia by Lema Gbowe, you see that women's bodies have been instrumental to the social movements that have taken place. They stripped immediately. And you understand that in the African context, you understand that when a man, or not just a man, boys or other people see a nude grown, the nudity of a grown woman, it means something. And so it's different in the Western culture, where you're talking about like, oh, free the nipples, or like those kind. It's different, and this is why you need to understand feminism. Also, I'm not saying that you shouldn't understand it in the Western perspective, but you also need to understand how it is positioned in the African context. And so sometimes you hear people say, oh, feminism is un-African, oh, this is this, oh, this is that. But then you think about
Somebody
the
actually
women's
just
war.
made a comment. Yeah, sorry. Somebody just made a comment that the word makes
Oh,
African men
it
uncomfortable.
makes African men uncomfortable. And so when you think about, that's why I always talk about how were men and women, not just men and women, because I keep using the binary, which is wrong, but like how did people live within a gender context before colonialism? And so you see that, look at the Aba women's riots that took place. Women had a voice to speak against the ways that they were exploited by the colonials, or that kind of thing like that. And so you have situations where people say feminists are angry women, feminists are women that are divorced, or women that cannot find husband. And so they always act, this is part of the stereotype, they attach a woman's worth to
Yeah.
the development of a man. And so these are just some of the misconceptions that you have about feminism. Or they say, oh, a feminist is a woman that she's carried education on her head and she can no longer see. And so you have all of these things like that. And they tell you that, oh, irrespective of your feminism, what do you call it? You hear last. It's a
Hmm.
man that would bring that crown down. You hear all of
Yeah.
these things like that. And it's really sad. And one of the things I also do not, that is why I talked about sisterhood previously, because I really like that when you're thinking about sisterhood, in the sense that your development is my development and my development is your development, you would not misuse the feminist movement. For example,
Exactly.
as much as we are fighting for women's rights, as much as we are fighting particularly for what do you call it, for queer bodies, for queer people, for victims of sexual assault,
Hmm.
you should not misuse that movement by centering your voice in a way that hinders the voices of other women. For example, you shouldn't say that, you shouldn't cook up a lie and say that, oh, I'm a victim, because people already do not like feminism. And so it's like they're always looking for ways to bring down
Exactly.
that movement. And so it's
Exactly.
always good when you don't try to, oh, feminists should be angry. And so I always say that, I didn't know, I really like Audre Lorde, and I really like her. She talks about the uses of anger, and this is one of the materials I recommended in my book. And so when I speak with men particularly, they say, oh, you're not like other feminists. And I said, I don't understand how I'm not like other feminists. And they said, oh, you're so calm, you're so quiet. And I said, no, you don't have the right to tell me how I should channel my anger. So you don't have the right to compare me to another woman, that kind of thing like that. And so every woman channels her anger differently. And what do you call it? What exactly is anger? in that situation. And so these are just some of the things that we need to think about. And so when I always say that, as much as they've been stereotypes that have been perpetuated by men or by other social actors in the society, I think that as women we need to also start understanding the movement and not taking advantage of it, because you say, oh, I'm a feminist, I can do this, and then you run again and say, oh, no, and then, oh, I'm a feminist, I can do this, and you're like, no, it's like, no, it doesn't work that way, that kind of thing. Like that is, of course, feminism perpetuates it's propagates freedom, but not that kind of freedom in the sense that like you're misusing feminism or like something like that. Yeah.
So many wonderful points you discussed, because not a lot of people really understand what feminism is about, which is why they carry their own stereotypes and they just put it out there without really getting it. And the truth is that it's not even only men. Some women also don't understand what feminism is about. Like, so some women think that feminists are also just angry women, and they actually advocate to not call yourself a feminist, but just say you're into gender rights. I've met women who are like fighting for women causes, but they don't want to call themselves a feminist because it's attached to so much negativity. So we really need to understand it and have a better conversation about what feminism is actually really about. And what you also said about gender violence, like, it's not helping the cause when some people are going out there and they are lying and saying this happened when it didn't happen. Like, it just makes things worse. So, like, I would only hope that we women will be more honest, and people who are coming out, like, if you are telling your story, let your story be real and valuable. Don't just use it because maybe you're trying to get publicity or trying to get money. Like, it doesn't help our cause, the whole feminist agenda cause. Like, I'm glad that you done that, because it also makes me angry when you hear all these stories that somebody said that this person did that and it wasn't true. Like, it takes away from another person's story who actually
Yes,
experienced
it does.
terrible. Yeah, so
Yeah,
thank you
it
so much.
does. Yes.
Yes. So let's also go back to what you are doing about teaching courses around African feminism. Please tell us more about that, because I wish I could take those courses. Like, I want to do that. Yes.
Oh, okay. I think. Oh, okay. So one of the reasons why I started Africana feminism with a K and ending with an A is because, like I said, I have been trained to think from a Black feminist perspective. And so I've read about Patricia Hill Collins, Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, many of these women. And so I began to understand that I wanted to know more about my own people or where I'm coming from. And so that was one of the reasons why I said, oh, I think I want people to know about what do you call it, Winnie Mandela. I want them to know about some of the things she has done, irrespective of the things that people, the stories that have been told about her. And so all of these things like that. So that was the whole idea of why I created Africana feminism. But within creating Africana feminism, I also wanted to raise questions about what does it mean to be Black and to be African.
Wow.
Because when you, like now, I think I talked about my positionality because I'm no longer existing within the African continent. I've moved across borders. And so how does borders change your identity and the ways you see things? And so those kind of things. And then like, what does Blackness mean, particularly to people in Egypt, in Morocco, in Tunisia, places where you have more lighter skinned people, and there's their concept of anti-Blackness in those places. And so these are some of the things that I wanted to know. And I also wanted to have a kind of conversation between Black feminists and African feminists, or like Black feminism and African feminism, to be in a kind of conversation. And so when you're talking about, and not just that, I always talk about African feminisms with S, because African feminisms is so, it's in multiples, because the feminism that takes place in South Africa is different from the feminism that takes place in Western Africa. And so you have conversations about race to a certain degree in countries like Zimbabwe, South Africa, which I'm not saying we don't have racism in Nigeria. We do, because it takes a different shape. When you're talking about racism. And so, but it's a kind, the way it is being formed, the way it exists outside of Western Africa is different. And then you're talking about North Africa. So you have the religion plays an important role in North Africa, particularly after the post-Arab Spring. And so, for example, most of the time, people don't often think of countries in North Africa, their feminism as African feminism. They relegate them to, you hear Islamic feminism, transnational feminism. And you're like, these are Africans. We are Africans. And so it's just like looking at, so one of the things, because I understand that I'm a Nigerian and that most of the time when people are talking about feminism, they only know Chimamanda, Ama Atal. They know like what these are the people they know. So one of the things I did during Africana feminism course was to recommend materials that were largely outside of Western Africa or West Africa rather. And so I concentrated on what are Sudanese women doing? What kind of social movement is taking place there in Tunisia, in Morocco, in Kenya, in Southern Africa? Like how I think we read a book by Sisi Dangbaremba, who is from Zimbabwe. And so one of the things I wanted my students in the class to understand is, how do I know about the other African woman? What do I know about her?
The
Those
ones that
kind
are
of
not
things
as
like
popular, not the ones that we are always
not the
seeing.
ones those kind of things like that. And
Yeah.
so the person I've really fallen in love with is Wangari Maathai. I just really love her because I feel like she's always been ahead of her time, and she's been thinking about sustainable development and feminism. And so these are some of the things I concentrated in within my course. That I want to be thinking about sustainable development within an African feminist perspective. And this is just some of the things that Africana feminism did. And I really like the class because we had students from Zimbabwe, from South Sudan, from Namibia, from South Africa, from Cameroon. Of course, Nigeria was like the largest, definitely. Canada, US. So it was global. And that is why I have Africana feminism. And I also talked about reclaiming language. And so that is why I used K rather than a C.
Yeah.
And at the end of the A, like having Africana feminism, my mission is to talk about feminism from within an African, not within an African context, but like, how do we center the voices of people of African descent? And so when I say people of African descent, it doesn't mean you don't have to live in the continent before you're a person of African descent. And so,
Yeah.
for example, what does it mean to be a Nigerian American, even if you've never been to Nigeria? And so these are conversations that we have because like identity plays a role, all of these things like that. That's why I talk about the impact of borders, of migration, and how it affects your identity. Because when I come to America, I'm no longer African. They
Yeah, black.
recognize me as black before
Yeah,
being
black. Yeah.
African. And so those kind of things like that.
That,
These were
that's
just
a
some of the
different conversation.
conversations.
That is like a
So
different that I actually love to talk about that because it's huge. And what you say, trying to identify as a feminist and an African or a black person, like it's so different because I came across that issue also in university when trying to associate with women organizations. And I could understand that some of my black friends sort of wanted to have the organization just be for black women, whereas I was just thinking of having a women's center as a whole. But that's a whole different problem because with Black Americans, you know that there is also that whole aspect of not just only thinking about themselves as a woman, but also thinking about themselves as Black. So they feel like mostly other Black people would understand. So that's just
so
a big,
that's why I think
conversation. Yeah,
within feminism, what brings us all together is
yes,
intersectionality.
yes,
Intersectionality is what centers everybody's problems together: race, class, gender,
yes,
ethnicity, religion, everything. Intersectionality. That's it. It's like recognizing that I know you're coming from a standpoint, I recognize your problems, you recognize my problems, and that
exactly.
when we work together, your development is my development and my development is your
Yeah.
development. So
That's such a wonderful way to end the conversation. That was so wonderful, informative, enlightening. Thank you so much. If anybody has a question, they could just drop it and then we will try to answer it. We still have some time. Thank you so much. That conversation, honestly, when it comes to identity, especially in different
oh
cultures, how you see
yes,
yourself, that's such a big topic
That's, oh
because,
yes, because
and you know how
when you talk,
sometimes Africans and Black Americans, they can be this divide because we are coming from two different aspects. So the problems that they see are not the problems that we are also focusing on for several reasons.
yes, so
Yes.
that's why I keep saying that I have been brought up in a Black feminist perspective, and that
Yes.
I understand that these issues exist. And what one thing I'm trying to do with Africana feminism is to bridge that gap. That
Yes.
I want us to see ourselves as people of African descent, that kind of thing, like that, rather than saying, oh, of course we have things like diaspora. I'm not saying that we don't have specific issues, but I want us to see ourselves as, like,
As
Burna Boy's mom said, I need you to
exactly.
understand that you're first African, or
Yes.
that kind of thing. Like, so yeah, like that's so important, like that's really
How can we have
important.
access to your course? Can
So
everybody have access?
I teach, I just, the summer module, it's a 6 weeks
Okay.
class, so the summer module just ended, and so I'm thinking of teaching it in probably in November. And if I don't teach it
Oh,
in November, then it will be January 2021. But I do have a waiting list, but I'm going to put the information out there. But currently I'm working on a business rather. So it's called Africana Academy. And
nice.
Africana Academy is a platform where I, not just me, but I work with all other educators to teach courses that are Afrocentric, with all
Yeah.
this Afrocentric pedagogy, Ubuntu pedagogy. And so it means that, for example, one of the courses I'm already like working on is the spectacle of African bodies. So I want to talk about women like Sarah Batsman that were taken from South Africa and to, what do you call it, Western communities, and their bodies were, I don't know, they were paraded on like those kind of like freaks and all of these kind of things like that. But like, what do you call it? Just like talking about the spectacle of African bodies and how you have human zoos in the Western communities, human zoos that are comprised of African bodies. So one of the things with Africana Academy is that it's a platform where I'm going to I, along with other educators, will use materials that talks about our own histories to teach us, to teach each other. And so those kind of things like that. So rather than just saying that let's talk about feminism, we are we are not just only going to recommend feminism from a Western perspective, but feminism, or materials rather, that uses that we African women have written about feminism, something like that. And though I also wanted to say that when you read books on feminist movement or feminism from a Western perspective, I can't remember the feminist critic that said, you read it from a critical lens. Read it to understand that when you're reading Western feminism, it is different from your own feminism in your own context. And so when you read it from a critical lens, pick what you think can be necessary or useful for you to fight your own battle. Those kind
Yes.
of things.
Yes.
So all
What
of
is
this,
relevant to your own environment and situation?
yes.
Yes,
Because
that's
the African
yeah.
context, we don't have one kind of feminism in Africa. We have
Yeah.
African feminisms, and Africa on a whole, as a whole, we are like a community. We believe in that community-based approach. Oh, and so when you're thinking about Western perspective, it's quite different, because when I came here, I said, "Oh, this place is cold," and when I say cold, I don't mean that physical cold, but like, of course, when I'm moving in Nigeria and I'm walking on the street, or I'm just like, "Oh, good morning, hi," but like here,
Yes.
okay, and you're like, oh, okay, okay, like all of these things like that, it's just different,
We need to
like
talk more
it's
on
too
this,
many things,
talk more
like,
because there's so much I can say. I understand you about this and so many other different aspects. So thank you so.
yes,
I'm just so happy we had this conversation. Like, nice to meet you virtually, and you're doing wonderful work. So just keep it up. And I'm glad that you were able to enlighten us about feminism. Thank you so
thank
much
you
for
so much.
joining this
Hopefully
session.
we'll see in person
We will see.
someday,
We will
like,
see someday. Yes.
definitely, like,
Yes.
definitely. Oh, I wanted to say one last thing, sorry
Yes.
about that, but
No.
when you're looking at because like I said, I did like a kind of fellowship with the with the Beijing movement, the Beijing platform, which is under the United Nations, or the UN Women rather. You see that when they went to the forum, particularly in 1995 during the Beijing conference and during the conference in Mexico, you see that white women and other women of African descent were clashing on ideas, because
Wow.
while black women were sorry when white women were talking about their own problems and saying, oh, we need to do this, black women started talking about the fact that you cannot talk about feminism without race, because
Yeah.
I am you look if you're talking about my problem as a woman, I need you to understand that I am black, and when I'm black,
Yeah.
there's a problem, because like those kind of things. And so women of other African descent who were talking about the fact that apartheid affected them, colonialism affected them. And so it's like, when you think of feminism, it's not just like gender, but like
Yeah. Like different
intersectionality
aspects that are
of
broken
other
down. So
aspects.
a white woman
Yeah.
thinking about her issues is completely different from a black woman. A black
Yes.
woman's issues is completely different from an African woman. So
Yes, all of these
yeah,
things like that. So it's just like really,
there's so many
it's
different
just,
aspects.
yes. And so it's like, as a feminist, you need to recognize that. That is why I said recognize your positionality. Because if you don't, you will be blind to the problems that when we other women are facing,
Are going
or
through.
the struggles, those kind
Yeah.
of things like that. So it's just like really
Yeah.
important.
Because once you recognize your position and you can understand that the challenges you face are different from the challenges that another woman faces,
Yes.
so you cannot ignore that challenge also.
Yes.
Thank
So
you
it's
so
just
much.
like, if someone asks me that, oh, is there no education in Africa? And I say, oh, I
Hmm.
was educated. Yeah,
Okay.
we have access to education. But like, no, it's a because of my standpoint, I may be speaking from that, which is wrong. Those kind
Yeah.
of things like that. So it's just
Yeah.
so many things. Yeah. Thank you
It's so
so much
wonderful.
for giving me this
Yeah, no,
platform
it's
to just
fine.
like
I'm so glad we had this conversation. I love
have
it.
conversations.
So much more that we need to talk about. Like, we really have to continue to keep in touch. I'll continue to follow you. You're doing such amazing work. So thank
Thank
you for
you.
being here.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
All right. Take care. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on this
Of
platform.
course. Of course.
Thank you
Thank you
so
for
much.
inviting us all. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in to watch to this session of Girl Talk with Issy. And I'll see you on the next session. Bye.
Bye.
And now.